Welcome to the Student Ministry Podcast. This is episode 65 of the Student Ministry Podcast. My name is Steve Cullum, and I'm your host here at the Student Ministry Podcast. And before we jump into this great conversation I have today, before we talk about sponsors or anything like that, it is important for you guys to know this is episode not only 65, this is also our 5-year anniversary episode. So, of course, all that I'm able to do here on the podcast is all because of God. But I also want to thank you guys, the listener, because you play a huge role in this. So thank you so much for just continuing to come back every time we post a new episode, for listening, for sharing it with others who you think would enjoy it. That's huge. It plays such a large role in how this podcast has grown over the years, over the last 5 years. And so thank you so much. Please continue to subscribe. Please continue to help us get the word out to other youth workers, other people that you think might enjoy what they hear on the podcast. You just play a huge role. You have no idea how big that is. And you're a big part of the reason why we've made it to 5 years. I had no idea what God is going to do in the future. Maybe he's going to give us another 5 years. Maybe he's going to give us 10, 15, 20, I don't know. But I'm just so grateful for every chance that I get to do this podcast. And every time he allows me to have conversations like we do with the guests today, just to be able to talk about ministry with people, to be able to hear what God is doing in the lives of others, and just celebrate that together, to learn from each other. That's what this podcast is all about. So thank you guys so much for making that, for doing your part to make it what it is over the last 5 years. And if you have not subscribed, please do that. If you've not left a positive review on your favorite podcast app, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find this podcast, please do that. That helps a ton as well. And of course, continue to share this with other youth workers that you think would enjoy this podcast. Also, if you haven't followed us on social media, you can do that. The links are in the show notes. But we are at StuMinPod on Twitter and at the Student Ministry Podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. And you can follow us there and continue to recommend other people that we need to talk to about their ministry. Today is a very special day because I get to revisit a previous guest. Dan Navarra is back on the podcast, and he's going to be talking about the Youth Ministry Compensation Survey. He's been doing that for the last several years, and it's such a huge resource in the lives of youth pastors. But also we have his friend at Chemistry Staffing, Matt Steen. And so I'm going to talk with both Matt and Dan today, especially about how to market yourself, or how to get a job, or how to transition well in youth ministry. I think that's huge. I think right now there's so many youth pastors that are either starting out or thinking about changing roles or changing jobs, changing churches, and make those transitions. And so it's going to be a very helpful conversation for you guys today. So please continue to tune in, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But before we jump into that, let's thank the sponsors of this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. Our first sponsor, G-Shades, is a youth ministry curriculum and teaching strategy focused on helping students see everyday life situations through the lens of the gospel. G-Shades has options to fit everybody. With 3 plans to choose from, this curriculum gives you the resources that you need to do what you want to do better. Do you just need message outlines, discussion guides, and games? Just $16 a month. Looking for a higher production value that includes bumper videos, Instagram devotionals, and parent guides? That's $25 a month. Or do you want an affordable youth ministry video curriculum that will help you increase your online reach during the pandemic? G-Shades has you covered for only $36 a month. You won't find youth ministry video curriculum at that price anywhere else. G-Shades really does offer something different than most of the other curriculums out there by offering this huge focus on the gospel and how to see life through the gospel. Mike Haynes is the founder of G Shades, and you can hear more from him on episodes 32 and 55 of the Student Ministry Podcast. So head over to gshades.org, that's GSHADES.org, to download Season 2 of G Shades Youth Ministry Curriculum and use the promo code UNITED at the checkout to get an extra $5 off. That's UNITED at the checkout to get an extra $5 off of your order. G Shades, seeing life through the lens of the gospel. Also sponsoring this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast is an app called MinHub Youth, made by a student pastor to help people like you and me. MinHub Youth helps you store and track your student, staff, and parent information, as well as attendance for your events. There are tons of features, but today I want to talk to you about event plans. Every event includes a plan where you can create blocks of time and even assign staff responsibilities to fill it in. Then all of your leaders can see a schedule of the night, what songs you're singing, the sermon outlines, small group questions, and all those type of things. And the whole plan can be created right in the app, and the right leaders can collaborate without having to find a time to meet. The app is only $5 on the iOS and Android App Store, and you can use it forever on that one device without ever paying any more. But if you want to sync your database across multiple devices or with other leaders, you can sign up for the MinHub Sync service and support the Student Ministry Podcast by visiting minhubsync.com/SMP for Student Ministry Podcast. That's minhubsync.com/SMP. Thanks to both G Shades and MinHub for sponsoring this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast, and you can find links to both of them in the podcast show notes. All right, let's jump into this conversation with Dan Navarra and Matt Steen of Chemistry Staffing. Well, thanks so much for being here, Dan and Matt. I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast.
Glad to be here, buddy.
Hey, man, it's good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, longtime listeners of the podcast will remember back on episode 38, we had Dan talk about youth pastor compensation and YP Comp Pros and all that he has been doing through there. And today we have his friend Matt Steen, both of them from Chemistry Staffing. And we're just going to talk to them about a bunch of things surrounding youth ministry, kind of transitions and the compensation question and all those things. But before we jump into that, I'd love for you guys to just share your story, a little about who you are, but also what God's been doing in your life to bring you where you are today. So Dan, would you mind starting?
I'd love to. Thanks, man. Yeah, it's good to be back on the podcast. It's been a crazy 2020 and now 2021 for me, as it has been for so many people. Last time I was on the podcast, I had just started YP Comp Pros. It was the third year of the Youth Pastor Compensation Survey. And somewhere in 2019, Matt reached out to me. Matt will share who he is, but he works as the co-founder for Chemistry Staffing. He reached out to me and said, hey, why don't you join our team and bring along the YP Comp Pros crowd? And so I did. And now I run the survey through Chemistry Staffing, still working with the guys over at the Youth Cartel. Love them, dear to my heart. And so I joined the team with Chemistry in 2019 and published last year's survey with them. Published it again this last, I guess it was January. And that's all on the chemistry and youth pastor compensation side of things. But personally, for me, 2020 was an interesting year. It was year 15 of youth ministry for me. And right after COVID hit, I watched youth pastors who love youth run through walls trying to figure out how to do ministry in COVID, ministry in the wild, as I like to call it. And to be honest, this is, safe space or whatever, Student Ministry Podcast, anybody can hear it. My heart wasn't there. And what it did was, after some spiritual direction, a little bit of counseling, it kind of revealed to me something that I actually knew already, but I had kind of ignored for the few years prior to that. And that was that I knew my window in youth ministry was closing for me personally and what God was calling me to. And so in May, I did one of those conversations with your boss where you say, hey, I'm feeling like God's doing a new thing. And I actually asked my church if the 2020-2021 school year could be my last school year. So I was giving them a whole year's notice to see if that could be my last year doing student ministries. And I was already doing a lot of other things at the church, kind of some executive roles. I was on the preaching team, all kinds of stuff. And so I was hoping that they would make room for me in adult ministries. And they took the summer to talk about that as an elder board. And then in September, I had an annual review, and I have statistics on annual reviews. Only 84% of youth pastors have annual reviews. In my annual review, I got the answer I was not hoping for. The church said, you know what, we're not going to be able to have room for you in adult ministries. It was already a staff-heavy church, and I kind of knew that was an option. And so we came to an agreement that I would actually wrap up at Thanksgiving in my role. And so I had October and November and the rest of September to prepare my team and transition really well. And it was a beautiful transition. I know many of your listeners, Steve, have terrible transitions in their story. Mine was not one. I preached my last Sunday, and you would have thought I was planting a church. They pulled me up on stage, prayed a blessing over me. The congregation sent in like a stack of like thank you cards. I mean, there was gift cards, there was all kinds of cool stuff. And it was really, it was an honoring thing for me after 6 years on staff at that church, but I think it was ultimately a God honoring thing because so many transitions in church just stink.
Yeah.
Especially in youth ministry, they happen abruptly. I mean, the amount of stories you and I have probably heard of guys who, have youth group on Wednesday and get fired on Thursday, and they have to clean their office out before Sunday. Like we laugh on the podcast here about it, but like, I bet you 50% of your listeners have had that happen to them. I've had it happen to me before. And so it was a beautiful transition. And right now I am in the middle, in the between. I am waiting for what God has next for me. And I'm an Enneagram 3. That is a nervous place to be because I have no plan. I am filling in around town. I'm, guest speaking wherever I can right now, trying to find something in adult ministries. And it's tough, man. I mean, I don't want to move my family and my kids and all that stuff. I mean, it's a really weird place for me to be, but I've found God in the middle of it at every single turn, to be honest.
That's awesome.
When I've found myself discouraged, I've found godly encouragement from people. I mean, even Matt has been on Zoom with me, however many times in the last few months saying, man, we're going to figure this out. We're going to get you through this. And it's been a new horizon for me of joining. I work for chemistry staffing as a church coach. I'm also now a candidate for chemistry staffing, as well as some other search firms out there, trying to just spread my net as wide as I can and figure out what God has next for me. And it has been a crazy journey, but I know God has been in the middle of it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, man.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, Dan.
Dude.
Matt, little about you.
Yeah. So nothing nearly as dramatic in 2020 as what Dan's going to kind of. I started off, I was a youth pastor for 8 years. Loved every minute of it, got old, and, started to realize that, the all-nighters just weren't my thing anymore. Went off, planted a church in the Baltimore area, had an absolute ball doing that, served as executive pastor in a few different churches. But along the way, one of the things that was kind of an understanding with the churches that I served in is I was going to have some sort of side gig in the capital C church, right? I was going to be 2 feet planted in the church where I was serving and whatever role that was, but I was also going to do something that was going to serve the greater church. And so there's been different iterations of what that's looked like through the years, but the most recent one was chemistry staffing. So we started this about 4 years ago, and really there was 3 reasons we wanted to do it. We wanted to be able to kind of come alongside churches and help them kind of change that national average from people being in place from 3-ish years and see if we couldn't get people that are going to be in place for 5 years. Right. And the stability and the health that comes from that for the church is just amazing. Right. Second thing we wanted to do was we just wanted to make the candidate process not so soul sucking. I mean, we've all in this room, I'm sure we've been through a search process. We've gone, my last search when I was looking for myself personally, I'm a little geeky, so I put tracking pixels in every resume I sent out just to see if people were checking them and that kind of stuff. 85% of the people that opened my email with the resume and stuff in it didn't respond. Didn't get a hey, here's what's next. Didn't get we filled it already. Didn't get anything. Didn't get the, oh, you suck, we don't want you. It's just like, and nothing, crickets. And what we found is that that's not uncommon. Right? It's not uncommon for resumes to go out and nothing to come back. And so we figured, let's find a way to make this a little bit more human, and let's at least send people emails back when they get stuff. So part of it was we wanted to make it a little bit more healthy, and we wanted people to not have to go into therapy based on the search process once they found a place. And then the third thing for us, and this is how it started with Dan, was we wanted to create an alternative income stream for pastors. And so we've got guys like Dan who are in a local church who are serving well in their their calling, but we're able to kind of help come alongside and cover the cost of Christmas and cover the cost of vacation, and give you a little bit more extra money in your pocket so you can be honest with the elder board, and those types of things. And so we found if we can do those three things, we're helping churches get healthier. And so that's really what happened. And so we launched 4 years ago. 2 years ago, I had to make the hard decision to leave the church I was serving. I was out in the Sacramento area, left that church to do this full time. And man, it's been a blast. So we get to do some really cool things, really help some really great churches build their teams. And man, I tell you, it's pretty cool to watch. So,
nice. Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit more, because I know some people listening to this probably have no idea that organizations like yours exist. So you kind of gave a bigger overview kind of picture of what chemistry staffing does. Let's dig into the details just a little bit to help people like, okay, what do you guys do that can really benefit youth pastors or future youth pastors that are out there?
Yeah. So, I'll tackle this from the church side first, if that's okay, because I think that'll make a lot more sense. When we partner with a church, we handle the whole search for them. So from start to finish, what we do is we'll market a search, we'll do the initial resume screening, we'll do the initial rounds of interviews with a church or with a candidate, and then what we do is we shoot to bring a church 2 to 3 candidates that we're pretty convinced are going to be there for 5 years or longer, right? Okay. And so these are people that we've screened, that we really, knowing the church as we do, having done the homework with people that are applying, we're pretty convinced that they're going to be a good fit. And so the way that we kind of talk about this is we really look for 5 things, right? Five key factors of a long-term fit. The first is theological alignment, right? Now, when I was a youth pastor, it's like, theology, I don't, and I'm still that way, honestly. Oh crap, this is recorded. But theology is important. And what we're seeing is that if we send somebody who's like hyper reformed into a Wesleyan church, you're going to make it maybe 6 months, and then there's going to be a hostage situation. Yep. It's just not going to work. Right. And so much of what we try to do is make sure that the closed-fisted issues line up with candidates and churches. Good. The second thing we look for is the type of church culture that somebody's been in, right? And so what we found, and you've probably seen this, somebody going from like this really entrepreneurial, pastor-led, run, make decisions on the fly type of environment. This might be my story. Going into a congregationally led church where everything is voted on by committee and run up the ladder and takes about 7 months to decide, if we can change brands of toilet paper. That's probably not going to work out too well. And so we really kind of hone in and look and say, okay, so can they survive in this? Or are they going to be yanking their hair out? Is this going to be a good fit? Or, so we're looking at those types of church cultures. Geographic culture plays into it too. But the bigger deal, honestly, is that church culture they've been in. We look at personalities. Does the personality fit the team? Vice versa. Look at skill set. Can they do the job? Does it look like they are ready to step into it? And then the fifth thing for us is really chemistry, and that's, do I want to spend the next 5 years with this person? Or, 18 months in, are we going to be, praying that, they finally, mysteriously, God calls them somewhere else, right? And so what we found is that we're really good at the first 4, and we kind of let churches focus on the chemistry piece and the candidate focus on the chemistry piece. What we found is that most churches, and honestly, this was true as me as a youth pastor looking for jobs too. We would look at skill set and we'd look at chemistry, right? And so what did that mean for me, in the church? That means we look at a resume. Oh yeah, they can do the job. They've done it. Look, they've got, 100 people in their youth group. Of course they're great.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been at this church, this name brand church, right? Of course they're going to be awesome. And then they get into an interview and they start to laugh at jokes. And it's like, oh yeah, we really like this guy. It reminds me of my nephew. And you get deep in process and everybody's feeling warm and fuzzy. And me as the youth pastor, it's like, oh, they really like me. This is going to work. And somebody's got a nagging question in the back of their head about theology or cultural pieces, or do I really like the senior pastor, but they're going to give me a job and they're going to, and so we get so far down that it becomes tough to say no on both sides. And so much of what we do is we help churches and we help candidates say no to each other because, for one reason or another, it's not going to be a good fit. So that's the church side. The candidate side, so much of what we try to do is as candidates are putting resumes in with us, we're trying to keep in touch with them. We're trying to let them know where things stand. We're not perfect at this. So, send hate mail to Dan. But so much of what we try to do is we offer people, if we don't have a role for them, we've got a couple guys on our team that their whole job is just to, spend some time, just kind of do a quick Zoom call and say, hey, tell me about your story. How's your search? How can we be praying for you and your family? Even if we don't have a job for them, but just to kind of get a sense of what's going on. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of, as we take candidates through, we do an assessment process that's really quick, typically takes, maybe 30, 45 minutes, compared to some of what else is out there, but it's quick. It asks you a bunch of questions, helps us kind of get a sense of where you are. And then we do a series of interviews. And what I love about our team, Steve, and I'm going to gush, but what I love about our team is I mentioned earlier that we try to create an alternative income stream for pastors. Mm-hmm. So everybody on our team is either currently serving in a church, has recently retired. We've got a couple other people that have kind of jumped into this full time because they're nuts. But we are pastors first, right? And so in our calls with our team, it's like, hey, there's going to be times when you just need to stop interviewing and start pastoring. And sometimes that means, hey, you've just been through a brutal situation and I am sorry. How's your wife doing? How's your family? Do your kids hate church? Is this a time, and nobody likes to hear this, but is this a time to kind of step back from ministry for a season, get healthy, find a way to, to pay your mortgage and all that. Mm-hmm. But is this a season? Because ministry is going to be there. What we don't want to see happen is you go so toxic that you can never come back. So we do a lot of those types of conversations. And we also have the conversations like, dude, I know what you're saying, but don't ever say that again, So we do some coaching on the fly in process. Uh-huh. And really for us, even though we get hate mail for it from time to time when we tell somebody no for a church, what we're really trying to do is find a candidate a place where they're going to be, for 5 years or more, be in a place where, they're going to be able to have some really fruitful ministry and really pursue their calling in a healthy, sustainable way. So that's cool. I feel like I just gushed way too much on that one. So,
oh, it's helpful.
You can see, Steve, how it meshed well with the YP Comp Pros kind of idea, because I got into this whole thing because I wanted to help youth pastors find longevity and sustainability and health. And it matches perfectly with the chemistry DNA. And that's why it's been such a great fit for me to work with them, because we really do, like, my heartbeat is that pastors and churches will find each other in healthy situations, and that leads to longevity. And everybody listening here knows that, you got to get past that magic 3-year mark if you're going to have really fruitful ministry. We actually think the number's 5. 5 is when you're really hitting your pure oxygen kind of beautiful burn of ministry, where you've built your volunteer team, you've kind of created a rhythm, you've got those relationships and things like that. And so it's been really fun to see that happen. And what's really great, and Matt won't say this, but I'll say it for him. We did the math the other day. We're over 97% of the candidates that the company's placed are still in their role. Nice. 97%. Like that's pretty great. Pretty great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So Dan, as you go through this transition and things, like what are some things that you've learned, picked up along the way? How's chemistry staffing helped? And maybe there's other people that are listening right now that are going through this situation, maybe thinking about transitioning, or they are in the middle of transition. What are some things that you've learned and maybe learned together that you guys can pass along to them?
All right. So on the emotional side, I would say don't go it alone. Don't go it alone. There's and this is something that I think maybe I tend to lean into, but there's probably a stigma when you're out of work and you're a pastor that you're not a very good pastor, or at least that's the feeling that I feel sometimes. And it has been essential for me to have people in my corner that have cheerleaded for me. Those are friends, that's family, that's professionally, spiritually. So having candidate coaches, that's what we call them in our company, having candidate coaches that have just checked in with me and said, hi, how are you? How's your spouse? Things like that has been a breath of fresh air, because not every company out there does that kind of stuff. I just got to be honest with you. And the second thing on a more practical side is you got to create a master Google document of all your answers to all the questions. Because if I've filled out God knows how many applications in the last few months, and they all are some variation of the same, 20 questions. And so get yourself a Google Doc and copy and paste your answers and tailor make them for every single thing you apply for. Like I'm on the practical side now, right? Have a cover letter that's a generic master cover letter, and then tweak it for every single job, right? If it's a job that has a more of an emphasis on team building, talk about your team building at the front instead of putting it at the back. And if it's a job that's emphasized on, program leadership, then put that at the front. They just kind of tailor everything, but don't start from scratch every time, because dude, it's a grind to try and apply for all these jobs. And so that was some coaching that I received actually from Matt early on in the process. This is the first time in 15 years of ministry that I've gone more than 2 weeks without working for a church. And so Matt was like, dude, start a Google Doc. And it was the best idea I ever did. Those are two quick learnings off the top of my head that have been really mission critical for me.
Yeah.
Cool.
A couple things I'd throw out there. I think, first of all, we're going to share a couple of books with your crowd. One is Before You Go, and then one's When to Leave. Two really helpful guides and just questions to be asking yourself as you prepare for this. Things that they never taught you in Bible college, things that nobody ever kind of pulls you aside. But the author of the book is a guy named Wade Hodges. It's just a fantastic resource to sit down and kind of read through and be honest with yourself. I'd start there. I'd also build on some of what Dan was saying. You need to understand that there is emotional investment in this process, and it is way deeper and way more intense than you think it's going to be. Every time that you send a resume out, a little piece of your heart is going with it. Okay. Now I say that tongue in cheek, but I really mean that. You need to be wise, and you need to be intentional about where you send resumes. The days of, part of our story is Todd Rhodes is my co-founder. He started this little website called churchstaffing.com back in the dial-up days of the internet, right? Before most people were born. But he built that, he sold it. He went to work for an organization called Leadership Network. But we kind of joke that chemistry is kind of his penance for unleashing church staffing into the world, because what church staffing did was it opened up pools for people to be able to find churches that were outside of their region that could be a great fit. And so it did some really good things. But what it also did is it gave us the temptation to do what we call the spray and pray. You start going through every youth pastor listing on the website and sending a resume out. And you either get crickets back or you get rejections back. And every time you get cricket, all the crickets start to weigh up, right? All the rejections start to weigh up. And so, be intentional with your search. Do not send out resumes, to everybody, because, you may think you're tough, you may think you've got it, but those rejections, I got rejected twice by Rob Bell. Mars Hill Church. I sent one resume, but they sent 2 rejection letters. I'm still a touch bitter. This was like 10 or 15
one
years
was
ago.
Enough, but the second one.
The second one, it was just like a kick in the stomach. It's like, come on, man. I bought all your videos. So it's like, go into this realizing that it's going to be tough and that you need to be intentional. Dan's right. Get a list, because we still have churches that like to send out the 17-page questionnaire, and it's like, tell me your theology of the most minute thing ever. And it's like, I'm a youth pastor.
Hey, I filled one of those. I had 2 of them open on my web browser this last week applying for jobs. I sent the wrong one to the wrong church.
Oh yeah, don't do that.
True story. So I applied for one church, but I sent it to the wrong church.
Yeah. Don't do that. That's not a pro tip. So yeah, get the spreadsheet. Keep a bank of all the questions that you're answering in these things. What Dan's saying too, your cover letter, you should have different versions for different churches, and you should, it should be, you should tweak it for each church that you send it to. I'd even go so far as to say, hey, have a few copies of your resume that are tweaked for certain types of roles, and pick and choose which one you send out. That kind of stuff helps. The other thing that I'll do as well, and Google Docs and Google Sheets has made this so much easier because you can access it anywhere. Mm-hmm. Churches have the worst habit of like calling you, 6 weeks after you send a resume in while you're walking through 7-Eleven, right? And they want to have the interview right then. Right. So 2 thoughts. One, I know nobody that's like, I'm going to be 45 in a couple of weeks. I know nobody younger than me answers their cell phone anymore if they don't recognize the number. But if you're looking for a job, answer your cell phone. Also check and make sure what the answer machine is or the answer message is, because that's just saying, Second thing, if you keep track of the details of each job, and this is why you need to be intentional, otherwise it's just a beast. If you're tracking who you're sending a resume to, a little bit about the job, a little bit about, maybe link off to the job description wherever you found it, and have some details on it, so that when they call you and it's like, whatever church in Jacksonville, Florida, that you really don't remember sending a resume to anyhow, you can pull it up on your phone and say, oh yeah, this is a youth role. They're United Methodist. They're on the beach, and that could be really cool. So I want to try on this one. Right. But having that kind of stuff and putting that kind of forethought into it is going to serve you really, really well.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Cause I think that's those of us that went to Bible college may have a little bit of training in this, but some people are stepping into youth ministry or any ministry without that training and maybe have no idea, like, how do I even go about getting a job? Like, I know I have this passion for serving teenagers, and I know I want to work in the church. I feel God's calling, but the Bible doesn't tell me how to apply for a job in this. So that's cool to have those tips, but also know that organizations like you guys are there to help kind of fill in the gaps of those things that we haven't learned up to this point.
And I can say, so I've been in this game for 15 years in youth ministry specifically. Once upon a time, you used to just go to youth specialties, and they had the job board once upon a time. I got to be honest, if you're looking for a role in ministry, you need to become a candidate. Like and what I mean is you need to go to the chemistry website, click become a candidate, and create a profile and do that. And I've done that. I work for chemistry staffing, but I've done that with other search firms as well to widen my net, because there are people out there who are actually, the churches are paying people to find quality candidates. Well, that church is already invested financially in making sure they make the right hire. They don't want to hire the wrong person and pay for it, because they're going to pay for it and they're going to pay for it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's a great way to find a job right now. And I always tell churches that I'm talking to, man, our candidate pool, it's cared for because we want our candidates to be healthy. Like, come be a candidate with chemistry staffing, because it's a healthy place to be a candidate. And the way that we walk people through interviews cares for them. And that's just rare out there. Like, you're not alone.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. Cause we could all benefit from some coaching and some care along the way. I think that's probably, we could have a whole other podcast about, the lack of that within ministry leadership. Right. And so that's really cool that you guys are able to provide that alongside those candidates as well. Dan, I know that, this youth ministry compensation survey has been a passion of yours for how many years now?
This is year 4, man. Year four.
Okay.
Over 5,000 participants now.
That's amazing.
To date.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I know you just published your recent findings. You can find that on Chemistry Staffing's website, again, with all the ebooks and stuff that Matt talked about. The link to the compensation results and everything are also going to be in the show notes for the podcast. But Dan, I'd love to just hear some high level. What are some gleanings that came from this year's survey? What are some big things that we should definitely take note of as youth pastors?
Yeah, let me start out by saying 4 years in, there's been some trends that we've found, and it's good news and bad news, as it is with most things. I'll start by saying the thing that everybody always wants to hear. What's the average? What's the big number? The big number for 2020. So these are the 2021 results of what happened in 2020. The average youth pastor nationwide makes $48,938 a year. Okay. So let's just round up to 49 grand, basically $49,000. Now that represents a 2.1% increase over last year's data. Okay. And that year was a 2.5% increase over the year before it. Okay. So just year over year, we're seeing 2+ percentage point raises nationally among youth pastors. And that's good news. The federal cost of living adjustment that was given out this year, there's every year the feds, or not every year, but most years the Fed gives out a percentage cost of living increase that's linked to people's Social Security income and things like that. That percentage increase was 1.3% this year. So apples to apples, youth pastors are gaining on the marketplace, quote unquote, which is good because we all know that they've been behind for so long, right? So that's kind of one piece of the thing that I always like to kind of put it in context of how is it trending. Now, I will say something specific. California is its own world when it comes to the survey. The national average in California is like it's 17% higher than the national average, the average salary in California. Okay. So a lot of other states have a lower average salary than the average national salary because California is the third highest responding state to the survey traditionally. And it's light years. It's 11% more than the second highest state, which is Texas. Okay. So what's crazy though, last year, California, 2 years ago survey, California had an almost 5% average increase in salary. This year, it was static. Which is crazy. That means the national average, even though across the country it went up 2.1%, California stayed the same, which means every other state actually went up probably more like 3%, according to the data that we collected, which is a big deal. I mean, 3% of $50,000 is a lot of money. You know, you're talking about a good chunk of change right there that you see in every paycheck. And so it's kind of just important to know how things are trending because so many youth pastors, and Steve, you and I've talked about this before, they go years without seeing a raise. And the problem with going years without seeing just a 2% raise, right? 2% of $50,000 is $1,000, right? Mm-hmm. So going years without having a 2% raise, what happens is you fall behind. Mm-hmm. And this is what last year's data said. If you get to the 5-year mark, a lot of the times your tenure is worth 10% more to the church down the street. Guys, we see guys and gals leaving their youth ministry post between the 3 to 5 year mark to go take their second or third youth ministry job because it's going to pay more. And this is my story. I left a church that I was at for 5 years to go to the church I was just at. And that my first day, I had a 25% raise in my compensation because that church down the street, literally it was a town over, was going to pay me market value for what I was worth at the time. And so what's really important for youth pastors who don't want to leave their church and don't want to leave their students, and they love where they serve, because so many youth pastors love that part of the ministry, and that's good, is you got to keep this on the front burner with your personnel team, with your elder board, with your senior pastor, your executive pastor. And that's not to be pushy and arrogant and say, hey, I'm entitled to a raise and all that. That's not the language at all. But if you never ask, you probably won't get unless it's a mandated wage increase.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I tell youth pastors every time we do the survey, hey, you've got to have an annual review. And in that annual review, you've got to talk about your compensation. You've got to do that. And one of the things we looked at this year in the survey was Enneagram types. And profiled compensation by Enneagram type. Certain Enneagram numbers, if you know anything about the Enneagram, they have an easier time asking for something or feeling like they deserve to ask for something or feeling bold and courageous to ask for something. And other Enneagram numbers, that is like torture for them, right? They'd rather be locked in a coffin full of snakes and spiders than ask for a raise because of how it makes them feel internally. And so one of the things we uncovered this year, and it's incredible, like I love Enneagram 6s, but the Enneagram 6 is the loyalist. And statistically speaking, of all the Enneagram 6s I had take this year's survey, they are the third ranked lowest compensated Enneagram type number. So in the bottom third, and there was 0 Enneagram 6s that had a youth group of over 80 kids. So one of the things that, and I'm not saying that they're bad youth pastors. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is the Enneagram 6 has a tendency to stay in a spot longer rather than trying to advance their career because of their natural gift of loyalism. And the shadow side of this Enneagram 6 number, and the 6s all know this, is they have a phobic side to them. And so they get paralyzed and they don't act because they're afraid of rocking the boat. And so just knowing yourself and what barriers there may be to your career in ministry is a big deal. And so there's a whole section in the survey that we'll link to in the show notes that talks about this a little bit and talks about the successful quote unquote numbers and their earning potential, but also the barriers that they have to having longevity and things like that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Matt, from your side, how is getting the compensation survey stuff, how has that benefited your guys' ministry from chemistry staffing and able to help churches and everything? Is that, you guys are still somewhat, new to that, but has that been beneficial as you come alongside churches?
Absolutely. I mean, every church that we start to talk to, we have that conversation. It's like, what are we supposed to pay them? Yeah. Well, let's sit down, let's talk through that, and so something like this is just really helpful. I mean, it's also helpful for somebody that's going through the process to be able to start to do some research and figure out, okay, where should things be? Where should things stay? And, one of the cool things about what Dan's done is it also kind of helps us to understand, when should we be advocating for ourselves a little bit more based on, our wirings and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great tool. We've been able to use that with a lot of our searches that are doing youth searches to kind of help them come to some clarity on where they should be.
Yeah. Cool.
One of the things I want to do in 2021 is I want to try and present more of the data for senior and executive pastors in a way that not so that they can go, crap, we're not paying our youth pastor enough. That's not the point, but so that they can be more aware of things that they need to tend to, because I like to always say Sunday is always coming. And so churches that don't have an HR department, quote unquote, they're not always thinking about their wage, and they're not always thinking about, keeping things equitable for their staff. And did they have another kid this year? Or was that 2 years ago? And all those types of things. And so I like my personal mission this year is to help get this information in the hands of more hiring people so that they can be better equipped to actually do a search. And I ultimately see that as serving the kingdom of God in an incredible way, because they will start with a better base understanding of how they could care for a traditionally undervalued compensation-wise role in the church. And so I just think that'll go like huge steps on helping longevity among the youth pastor community.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think Dan just touched on something that I think is helpful to kind of circle back on, not compensation survey, study related directly. But, churches, may not have a HR department. It's not, this isn't like Walmart where everything is formalized and, everything is kind of laid out well. So for guys that are going through the process, youth pastors that are getting ready to transition, or even youth pastors that are in a place where it's like, they're starting to look around and say, my rent just went up, but my salary hasn't, you really need to advocate for yourself. You don't want to. Nobody wants to. Well, there's a few personality types that actually enjoy this, but for the most part, nobody wants to do it, and you need to you need to lean into it. And so there's some tools that you kind of need to be looking at. This is a great place to start. I would also really encourage you to, understand what the cost of living is in your area. Okay. So there's websites like datausa.io that are really helpful, whether you're in process of searching for a job or whether you're starting to say, hey, I need a little bit more money. That's going to give you a good idea of what the cost of living is in an area. I also encourage people to look at, especially in youth roles, start to look and see what high school teachers are making in your neighborhood, right? So what you might find, Dan talked about how California and Texas typically are the most well-paid ministry roles, right? And California is because of just a high cost of living. Texas is because, Texas churches just have more money than they should, I guess. I don't know what the problem is there. They always hose us. But that cost of living is not going to be the same everywhere. So if you're arming yourself with an understanding of what that looks like, typically, a high school teacher with similar time in service and similar degree and that kind of thing is a comparable place to look for a comparable salary. Typically, they want high school teachers to be able to live in that area, that kind of thing. Right. So the beauty of it is if you can go and Google a local school district and pay scale with a little bit of sleuthing, you're able to pull up, the teacher's contract and be able to get a sense of what they're paying for.
Cool. Yeah, that's so helpful. I think for those people out there that, and this is just from my personality type, but I think when I'm able to base things more in facts, it's so much easier to advocate for myself instead of saying, well, I think I'm worth this much. Instead, it's basing it on, like your cost of living and comparable jobs and things like that. Then it's a whole lot easier to say, okay, this is what I think I should be getting paid for doing this role.
Yeah. Helps you to be able to do that. And then you can go and, you can go and take it to the executive pastor, and that's always, that's the evil henchman on staff. I know I was that. And be able to kind of lay out a case and say, hey, this is why. And by the way, I just had another kid, and those things aren't cheap, and it's like to be able to lay that out and really kind of point to it. And this might be a surprise, most senior pastors and executive pastors are human. Most of them have a soul, and most of them want to see you do well and minister, in a way that's holistic and sustainable.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to kind of back that up, then that gives them the case to be able to take to their board and be able to have those conversations on your behalf.
Cool. I have one question that I see quite often in youth ministry Facebook groups, and it's the question of, when do I actually talk to a church about the salary? When I am in the hiring process and that sort of thing, I know the experiences that I've had, and I know some churches have been like, if they mention money in the first couple interviews, they're a no. But then other times people say like, it is good to talk about that up front because it is an important piece of the whole thing. What's your guys' opinions about when to bring up money in the conversation?
Okay, so here's my take on this. Okay. You need to mirror what the church you're talking to is doing. Now, that sucks because there's a lot of angst and agita that goes with that. Okay. But it's just like you said, if you lead off with saying, hey, am I going to be able to afford my Lex here? If you're starting like, am I going to make whatever, that's not going to go over well. Right. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that makes this so difficult and so complicated with churches is that there really is no standard guidebook on how to do these conversations. Mm-hmm. There's no standard play, that every church runs. It's different, even in the same denomination, it's different. So the way that I've done this in the past, and this worked for me, your mileage may vary. Okay. As I've gone through that process, I have, we've gotten to a point where we're starting to get serious, and I'll just say, hey, look, just so I know, and this helps because my wife is an accountant, Teresa is an accountant.
Yeah.
She's going to be wondering about this kind of thing. When do we talk package? When do we do that? Right. And typically it's deep enough in process that, if we're talking about potentially come do an onsite, that kind of thing. I'll just broach it, not in a tell me what I'm making, but I'll just kind of bring it up and gently kind of leave it out there and let them say. Now, the other thing that I'll do, because every church does this different, which makes it so much easier. Some churches will say, here's the offer, take it or leave it. Some churches will say, here's the offer, but are expecting you to counter offer. Some church, and some churches do some weird thing in between, right? And so nobody knows, because they use the same language. They say, well, here's what we'd like to offer you. And they don't say, take it or leave it. Mm-hmm. They also don't say, hey, we're willing to negotiate, or anything like that. So I have that conversation just up front, before we get to that point, and just say, hey, look, I know every church handles this different. I just need to know where you guys stand on this so I don't offend anybody. Some churches are expecting me to make a counter offer. Some churches, this is a firm number and there's no wiggle room. And I understand that, and I have that conversation even before we start to talk numbers, just so it's not weird. But those kind of clarifying conversations, if you have the relationship with people, I really encourage you to do that. Part of what we do as a firm is we get an understanding of what the church's range is on the front side of the search. And early in our process with candidates, we just say, hey, look, based on what you know of the area, where do you need to be? We don't discuss salaries that churches are offering. We don't talk about, this is what they're going to pay, or we don't set salaries for the love. But I mean, what we will do is we'll have that conversation up front so that we can kind of get a sense of, is there potential for this to work? Or is this person getting $120 in Texas, and this church in the Northeast is only going to pay 60? We don't want people's, hearts kind of getting knit together and then having the heartbreak. So that's kind of how we approach it as a company. Mm-hmm. One last thing, and this goes back to some of the research stuff, and I'm gushing. So, go into that conversation with the church, just like I said before. Know what it's going to cost to live. Know the difference in the cost of living between where you are now and where you're looking. Okay. There's websites that do really basic calculators on that. They're okay. They give you a ballpark. Mm-hmm. They're okay. Don't base everything on it. Do the work. Look at the school board's pay scales for teachers. Know kind of what the area is. Churchsalary.com is good too. And it's all hit or miss, but the more sources of data, Dan Study, school boards, different websites, datausa.io, all that stuff is going to really help you to lean in and get a sense of what it's going to cost to live there, so that you can be informed in those conversations.
Cool. That's so helpful.
I also, from on the candidate side, when a church puts a number in front of me, obviously you got to read the room a little bit, but my kind of rule of thumb, at least my approach that I want to have if I get to pick my approach, is whatever the number is, in my mind, I want to come back and ask for 10% more than that, assuming it's not a blow you out of the water offer. And here's why. Especially in youth ministry, we know it sometimes takes years for you to get that first raise. And so I often tell youth pastors, if you ask for 10% more and they meet you in the middle, it's a 5% raise, which 5% raise on your first day is not that bad. And it buys you a few of those years where you might be a little bit, the raises may lag, but at least you started out a little bit higher. And so the other thing is, and some people are like, man, wouldn't that be construed as greedy? Okay, read the room, right? But the other piece is, if you come back and say, hey, I was really thinking this number, and it's within shouting distance of what they offered, 10% shouting distance, right? The average youth pastor makes $49,000. So 10% is asking for 54, right? Right? That's shouting distance. If they come back and they shut the conversation off because you asked for 10% more, that's probably not a church that you want to have that conversation with further down the road, because you know how it's going to go 3 years from now when you ask for a raise, right? If that's how they treat the conversation about money, well, then that probably is a flag at least to consider along the way. Yeah, some churches say, hey, this is what we have budgeted for this role. We can't stretch it any further. It was COVID, okay, I get that. Like, read the room. But in general, if I get to choose, I try to have that approach. The other piece to consider is what the benefits look like. And this is a huge deal, especially if you've got a family, because they might pay you an arm and a leg more than the church down the street. But if their benefits stink and it ends up costing you all this money out of pocket to pay for your kids' medical and things like that, and they don't make a retirement contribution, I mean, you've got to do some math and say, how much do I actually need cash in my checking account every month in order to live?
Yeah.
And from there, figure out, can I afford to take that job?
Yeah. A good benefits package at a church. Now, every church does this different. Sometimes churches are just going to give you a total package and it's going to be whatever, and you got to figure everything out with it. Other churches, we still have some churches that are paying full health care for you, for your family, out of pocket on that. That might as well be, an extra 20-25 grand, depending on how big your family is.
Yeah.
That you do not have to cover. And I'll tell you what, there's some churches where you could go for 60 with that type of package, and it's a much better deal than being at a church where, they're going to give you 80 or 85, right? It's kind of understand that going in. The other thing too is, and we see this most particularly with youth pastors, know if they're going to give you a housing allowance or not. Know if that's part of the package. Because if you're getting a housing allowance at one church and one church isn't going to offer it to you for whatever reason, that housing allowance is actually, it's going to be helpful. Now, if you get a housing allowance, and if you are like me, who is a 7 with an 8 wing, who may not necessarily follow up on all the details of things, get yourself an accountant who understands ministers' taxes. Okay. I've got a great guy. If you need one, I'll recommend him, but get yourself a guy, because some of us in this call, not sure if it was either of the two of you guys, but some of us may have gotten into tax trouble early on because I didn't realize I had to pay quarterlies. So, just go into this, understand, that a housing allowance is a great benefit. But you need to spend some time understanding how to use it and talk to a tax person. That's why I'm not going to give a whole lot of details on what to do, because I don't want to get sued. But you also, because more pastors need accountants than think they do.
And Steve, I'll give you a link. We have a free housing calculator housing allowance calculator that I developed a few years back as part of the YP Comp Pros project, because so many people think whatever my rent is or my mortgage is, that's my housing allowance each month. Yep. And that's not actually it. And so you give that to your listeners. Like, there's no obligation. You don't have to sign up for nothing. Like, just use that to at least start your calculations. But like Matt said, you use a tax person.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. You've like just unleashed so many amazing tips that I hope are going to really benefit the youth ministry community out there as they're looking for new jobs in that world, or maybe transitioning or thinking about transitioning to a different church or a different job within the ministry community. I know that people are going to have questions. Maybe you've kind of scratched the surface on some things. They have some further questions they want to follow up with you guys on. So what's the best places for them to go to connect with you, maybe individually or chemistry staffing as a whole? Matt?
Yeah. So chemistrystaffing.com is home base. And love to kind of connect with you guys through that. And my email is matt.steen@chemistrystaffing.com. We'll link off to that. Feel free to drop me a line, talk to Dan. We'd love to work with you guys. For some of the people that are out there that are saying, look, I gotta do something here. I gotta move. I don't know how to get my resume in place or anything like that. We're starting to put together a boot camp for people like that. We have to charge for it. And I say that almost apologetically, but we kind of have to, because what we found is if we do it for free, people don't really lean in. But if you're struggling with that, we'll link off to that as well, but we'd love to be able to kind of walk with you through that season. We bring together 8 or 10 people that are in the same place and kind of coach you through what that job hunt looks like. Love to be able to, serve you guys that way. So
cool.
Yeah, and I'm Dan.Navarra, Navarra at chemistrystaffing.com. As always, I'm happy to answer and coach any youth pastors out there who need some help. And also, if you or your church or a church that you know of might be hiring in the future, man, right now, that's the thing that I'm doing that I get to contribute to the Big C Church with. And so I would be honored to come alongside your church and help find healthy long-term fits for any role: youth pastors, worship pastors, whatever, kids pastor. I mean, I'll find you a janitor if that's what you need, but minister of maintenance, right? No, but seriously, I would love to help however I can. So please, by all means, send me an email.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for being on the podcast today, and may God bless your ministry.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having us.
Thanks again, Dan and Matt, for joining us on today's episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. And thanks to all of you for tuning in for another episode. Remember that all of the links that Dan and Matt talked about, and there's a lot of them, really important links that you need to check out. Those are in the show notes of the podcast. So make sure you check those out for links to contact them, but also links to find out more about how to know when to leave and how to leave well and how to figure out your compensation and all those different things that we talked about today. All of those links are in the show notes, along with links for our sponsors. Both G-Shades and MinHub Youth are both in the podcast show notes. So make sure you check that out at gshades.org, and you could use the promo code UNITED at checkout to receive an extra $5 off. And also check out minhubsync.smp. That's minhubsync.com/SMP. And that's the way to not only support the MinHub Youth and thank them for sponsoring this podcast, but also to support the podcast as you do go to that site when you're ready to sign up for their sync service. Thanks to both MinHub Youth and G-Shades for sponsoring this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. Again, thank you guys so much for being here today. We'll be back next time with another conversation. But until then, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to share this with others. Be sure to leave a positive comment, a positive review if you like what you hear. We are so grateful for that sort of feedback as well. And if you know someone that we should get on the podcast, be sure to drop us a line about that as well. But until next time, may God bless your ministry.